The path begins with intention, not the intention to persuade, to interpret, or to impose a story, but to restore the conditions under which meaning can hold. The Dreamweaver begins here, with the decision to engage structure directly. His aim is coherence, not agreement or consensus, but symbolic alignment. He brings together what has come apart, not by forcing unity, but by offering forms that resonate with the structure of the mind. This work arises in times of dissonance, when understanding fragments, when symbols collapse into signals, when narratives freeze or repeat. The Dreamweaver enters not to supply answers, but to build the architecture in which insight becomes possible again. The consequence of structural breakdown is not confusion alone. It is the nightmare, inner and outer, generated when symbolic systems fail to metabolize experience. The Dreamweaver serves where these failures gather, not to fight the nightmare, but to render it obsolete through precision of form. This is not interpretation. This is craft. The Dreamweaver engages with meaning at its source, not its surface content, but its generative conditions. He works with pattern, with rhythm, with relation. His role is not to announce truth, but to sustain the grammar through which truth becomes recognizable. This grammar is symbolic, its logic is triadic, its medium is story. The Dreamweaver constructs symbolic coherence through composition. His practice begins with pattern. Every symbol, every image, every gesture gains force through its relation to structure. That structure is triadic, built from perception, sequence, and systemic resonance. These three functions operate together to generate sense. The Dreamweaver works by arranging forms that engage all three. Perception initiates. It delivers immediacy, color, tone, tension, presence. Sequence follows. It introduces motion, transition, transformation, progression. Structure completes. It reveals the logic of relation, repetition, return, interdependence. A symbol enters powerfully when it touches all three layers, felt in the body, tracked in time, aligned across form. The Dreamweaver selects symbols for their function within these systems of narrative and logic. Some forms provoke perception, others establish balance, reflection, inversion, or closure. Each element enters composition for its ability to sustain a triadic field. The Dreamweaver arranges these into symbolic architectures. The composition is alive when the triad remains active across all levels. Dreams arise through this activation. The symbolic field becomes charged. Relations clarify, rhythms surface. The psyche recognizes movement and completes it. Insight takes form. The Dreamweaver refines this process by working to demonstrate patterns of coexistence, reinforcement, and causation. He demonstrates creation through inclusion, conjunction, and harmony, and its negation through bottlenecks, reversion, and feedback. Each structure demonstrates how concepts emerge from the structured interplay of their components. Each one configures the relation between elements differently. Some enforce symmetry, some create recursion, some initiate expansion or closure. The Dreamweaver works with these as tools of construction to craft experiences the psyche can enter and metabolize. The result is not expression but organization, internal movement shaped by symbolic order. When a triad achieves coherence, meaning flows through it without obstruction. The system integrates, perception gains depth, narrative gains momentum, structure becomes visible. This is the path of the Dreamweaver, creating conditions under which sense holds, allowing rhythm to continue. And from this, transformation proceeds. Every gesture, every placement, every sequence serves this aim. He works as a technician of symbolic function, composing from within the architecture that makes recognition possible. When the form holds, the psyche moves. When the pattern activates, the dream enters. So dream. I woke before dawn. The world was black but not empty. There was pressure behind the dark, like the sky remembering light. At first I could not see the sun, only the outline it left in the shapes of things. The glint of dew, the slow sharpening of stone, the silhouette of a spire against the night's last breath. Then it rose, not all at once, but in layers. First the flare, then the body, then the blinding core. My eyes struggled. I saw after images, shifting colors, a trembling halo where light fractured, and then it settled into a sphere. That's when I understood. I had not seen the sun. I had seen the conditions for seeing. Emotion struck first. Wonder, fear, heat. Memory followed of every dawn, every fire, every moment I had ever woken into meaning. Only then did structure arrive, which I knew not as shape, but how the vision took hold. As the light expanded, shadows moved, trees cast long lines that bent, stretched, retracted. A bird rose and wheeled across the sky. Its motion was not random. It followed a path I had not noticed until it had already turned. I saw echoes, rhythm, sequences. One thing became another. The sun touched the stones and they glowed. The air warmed and the mist retreated. Each moment shaped the next. This was narrative, not just change, but causality unfolding. Yet I saw where it failed. A branch fell in silence. A shadow flickered the wrong way. There were breaks, feedback lost, contradictions left unresolved, fragments of action with no return. The sun did not stop shining, but the story of the day stuttered. That's when I looked directly at the light. It split. Rings formed around it. Not halos, but diagrams, arcs intersecting, curves within curves. I saw how light bent. I saw how distance made illusions of shape. The sun I saw was not where it appeared. What I called a sphere was fusion and gravity in constant tension, invisible, yet precise. This was logic, not the fact of light, but the structure by which it could be understood. Pattern observed, form recalled, resonance revealed. And with that, the dream ended, not with a message, but a task. To see again, not just what shines, but what holds the shining together. To influence the mind, one must first understand how the mind comes to make sense of anything at all. Contrary to the widespread assumption that the mind operates through isolated functions or disjointed impressions, the mind organizes experience through structured relationships. The mind does not simply perceive the world. It weaves sense, feeling, and understanding into a coherent whole. At the foundation of this weaving is a consistent triadic structure that underlies all meaning-making. This is not metaphorical. It is the actual architecture by which perception becomes narrative, and narrative becomes understanding. This structure, which we call the loom of the mind, enables us not only to experience life, but to reflect, remember, dream, and transform. The loom consists of three interrelated strands: direct perception, narrative patterning, and logical connection. These are not categories of content, but dynamic processes. They do not function in sequence, but in mutual influence. When perception occurs, it immediately enters into relation with the mind's instinct to shape events into patterns. That narrative impulse, in turn, is not random. It seeks alignment with structural logic, with recognizable forms of connection and consequence. Similarly, our sense of logic is not abstract. It depends on what is perceived and how it is patterned. Each element modifies and conditions the others. They coexist. When this triadic system functions in balance, the mind produces experiences that feel not only vivid, but coherent. This balance is what makes meaning possible. Direct perception is the point of contact between the self and the world. It includes not only sensory data, but emotional tone, symbolic imagery, and intuitive impressions. It is immediate and preconceptual. The moment before a thought is formed, before a story is told, there is a felt experience. That is perception in its purest form. It is the raw material of the symbolic mind. But perception alone, however vivid, does not explain itself. It must be placed into relation. That is the work of narrative patterning. The mind seeks shape, order, and continuity. It strings moments together into sequences, gives events a beginning, middle, and potential resolution. It senses causality not as a rule book, but as a rhythm. This is not the imposition of fiction upon reality, but the recognition of flow, how one moment conditions the next, how tension builds and transforms. In dreams, this function is especially clear. Symbols do not appear at random. They arrive within a movement, a scene, a shift. Pattern is what allows memory to coalesce and transformation to occur. Without narrative patterning, perception remains isolated and meaning cannot accumulate. Yet even narrative is not sufficient. Stories can wander or loop endlessly unless they are informed by structural insight. The third element of the loom, logical connection, brings order not through control, but through resonance. This is not logic in the narrow rational sense, but in the deeper structural sense. The recognition of patterns of relationship, particularly triadic patterns. When the mind sees that three elements are interacting, where one influences the next, which then loops back, or where a change in one produces a change in the other two, it is recognizing the logic of the system. These are not invented constructs, they are perceived. And once perceived, they allow the mind to transfer understanding across domains. A pattern noticed in a myth may illuminate a feeling. A shift in perception may expose the structure of a personal conflict. This is not abstraction. This is coherence made visible. When direct perception, narrative patterning, and logical connection operate in concert, the mind does not merely gather information. It recognizes structure. It feels the inner alignment of form and meaning. In such moments, dreaming becomes a mode of insight. Memory becomes mythic. Emotion becomes instructive. The psyche can rehearse possibilities, resolve contradictions, and simulate healing without ever needing to explain how. That is the power of a system in triadic resonance. It allows what is symbolic to become transformative. This model, the loom of the mind, is both a description of how experience is formed and a framework for how it may be restored. When perception fractures, when narrative stagnates, when structure no longer supports insight, the triad signals misalignment. The Dreamweaver works directly at this level. Through symbolic composition, he reactivates the system, selecting forms, establishing sequences, composing structures. He brings perception, narrative, and logic into resonance. He does not impose content. He constructs symbolic frameworks in which new coherence can emerge. The dream forms through this alignment. The loom is not only repaired, it is rewoven in the act of composition itself. Understanding this triad is not the end of our work, but the beginning. Every symbolic pattern that follows, every method of correction, transformation, or reintegration emerges from this foundational architecture. Only by understanding how perception, story, and structural logic interrelate can we begin to navigate the deeper layers of dreaming, and through them reshape the way meaning moves through the mind. If the mind weaves meaning through the interplay of perception, narrative, and logical structure, then the Dreamweaver's first task is to identify when this loom has gone askew, not in an individual's dream, but in the shared symbolic space, the public narrative, the media stream, the collective imagination. It is in these visible expressions that deeper cognitive distortions become evident. When the loom functions properly, Each of the three elements, direct perception, narrative patterning, and logical connection, shapes and is shaped by the others. But in times of confusion or collapse, one element may dominate, be suppressed, or become misaligned. The Dreamweaver learns to read these misalignments not through abstract models, but through signs, symptoms in the world that indicate structural failure in how people are making sense of their experience. The negations we seek are not simply ideological errors or moral failings. They are structural disruptions. Each one points to a distortion of one of the three strands of the loom, and each one deforms the others in predictable ways. The Dreamweaver must train to recognize these disruptions, not in isolation, but as relational fractures. When perception is distorted, people lose touch with immediate experience. Their engagement with the world no longer occurs through direct sensing or emotional attunement, but through representations, curated images, ideological filters, algorithmically tailored inputs. The symbolic field becomes artificial before it is even recognized. What is seen, felt, and processed has already passed through a layer of mediation. As this detachment deepens, perception becomes less about contact and more about consumption. This severing of contact reveals itself in strange ways. You may notice a sudden emotional intensity in public discourse that feels oddly hollow, outrage that burns hot but leaves no trace, as if nothing truly personal were at stake. In visual culture, everything gleams, but little feels alive. The same faces, formats, phrases, and expressions circulate endlessly, divorced from the moods or bodies that once gave them depth. Aesthetic repetition disguises as style. Sameness becomes invisible. Even the so-called raw is performed, spontaneity rehearsed for effect. Reality is consumed as a product, not met as an event. When perception is no longer grounded in present experience, narrative collapses into simulation and logic grows reactive or detached. The Dreamweaver recognizes this not as a surface issue, but as a disruption in the root thread. His work begins by restoring contact, not through argument, but by introducing symbols charged with ambiguity, immediacy, or emotional weight. The goal is not clarity, but re-engagement. Narrative distortion arises when the stories that connect perception to understanding either disintegrate or harden beyond movement. In one mode, stories fragment. Each moment stands alone, context vanishes, and people can no longer tell how one event leads to another. In the other, stories loop compulsively. The same injuries are rehearsed, the same myths retold without growth or change. This is not memory, it is fixation. Time becomes either unstructured or oppressive. This disorientation is easy to spot in how people talk. There's a growing sense that everything's happening all at once, or worse, that nothing is truly happening at all. Events blur into spectacle and fade without closure. New crises erupt before old ones have been understood. Conversations circle endlessly, returning to the same themes. Betrayal, injustice decline without new insight. The past is flattened into cliché. The future is reduced to doom or distraction. People live inside narratives they did not choose and cannot exit. When narrative time breaks down, perception loses meaning and logic loses traction. The Dreamweaver responds by reintroducing motion, symbolic markers of transition, disruption, or return. He reminds the field that stories are not just containers for emotion, but engines of change. The task is not to provide resolution, but to allow movement where it has stopped. Logic, when healthy, is the recognition of patterns that hold, relations that repeat, influence, reinforce, or resolve. But when logic becomes distorted, it mutates into either rigidity or collapse. The mind starts drawing connections that do not follow, forcing causality where only correlation exists, or abandoning structure altogether in favor of mood, affiliation, or mimicry. What remains is a shell of coherence. Arguments that feel true, not because they are valid, but because they follow a familiar, emotional, or rhetorical shape. This shows up everywhere. You hear people explain complex events with stunning confidence and stunning simplicity. One cause, one villain, one inevitable conclusion. Patterns are cited as proof, but they are drawn from style, not structure. Repeated phrases, hashtags, colors, vibes. Someone speaks with conviction not because their understanding is deep, but because their format is popular. Others drift into the opposite. Helplessness, irony, indifference. They sense that nothing holds, so they refuse to hold on to anything at all. Either way, sense-making is compromised. When logical patterning is lost or faked, the symbolic system breaks. The Dreamweaver sees this not as a failure of thinking, but of structure. His response is not to argue, but to offer patterns that truly cohere, triads that restore movement, balance, and reflection. The goal is not to force understanding, but to make it possible again. The Dreamweaver does not insert new meanings into a distorted world. He does not overwrite illusion with truth. His first act is more subtle, more dangerous, and more necessary. He introduces failure into certainty. Wherever meaning has calcified into ideology, wherever stories are so overused they no longer require thought, wherever symbols function without friction, the Dreamweaver intervenes not by clarifying, but by destabilizing. His technique is called interpretive negation, not because it opposes belief, but because it breaks the illusion that belief and truth are the same. Interpretive negation does not critique a narrative. It interrupts its structure. It does not reveal the lie. It makes the lie unworkable. Its power lies in its refusal to explain. Instead, it introduces forms that cannot be metabolized by a closed system. It restores cognitive elasticity, the ability of the mind to question, reflect, and reweave. There are many ways to negate, but all are aimed at the same goal, to make space for seeing again. The Dreamweaver does not offer a new interpretation. He disables the illusion that the current one is complete. The first domain of intervention is perceptual. At this level, symbols no longer signify, they simply trigger. Repetition has stripped them of ambiguity, irony, or charge. The Dreamweaver encounters this as a syntactic field of overcoded form. Images, words, gestures that no longer invoke attention, only reaction. These symbols are not engaged. They are consumed. To negate this overcoding, the Dreamweaver operates on form directly. He inverts the frame, placing familiar imagery in an incompatible setting, changing context to break recognition. A political slogan is spoken by a child. A sacred icon is used to sell a meaningless product, but played straight. The symbol still appears, but it fails to resolve. The mind halts. Interpretation is required. Alternatively, he may invoke saturation. When a symbol is still too effective, too intoxicating, he amplifies it into grotesque. This is the method of the recursive loop. The parody so extreme that it unthreads its own pattern. A belief repeated too perfectly reveals its absurdity, not through critique, but by exposure. The symbol collapses under its own weight. Where perception has been hijacked, ambiguity becomes a weapon. The Dreamweaver introduces polyvalent signs, images, or phrases with no immediate category. These are not vague, but overdetermined. They function as mirrors. Symbols that reflect nothing until the viewer searches for themselves. In some cases, the answer is void. A key element is absent. The frame breaks just before it completes. A sequence cuts off mid-gesture. Meaning is made possible not by presence, but by what should have appeared and didn't. The Dreamweaver does not explain the absence. He lets it ache. Interpretation rushes to fill it. Where perception has been conditioned to triggers, narrative has been trapped in cycles. In the semantic field, stories repeat compulsively, traumas retold with no transformation, victories staged with no cost, progress performed with no change. Time collapses. Everything becomes a loop. Interpretive negation here means interrupting the loop with a story that cannot be completed. The Dreamweaver re-narrates, not to impose new content, but to expose the structure of dysfunction itself. He tells the story of the loop. He mythologizes the compulsion. He dramatizes the unchangeable, not to glorify it, but to make it visible. Sometimes he exaggerates. A common trope is repeated so perfectly, it becomes a parody of itself. The redemption arc ends in another fall. The villain's speech is so reasonable it terrifies. He turns the logic of the loop against itself, not through criticism, but through story that shows where the logic leads. Sometimes he withholds. A long-awaited resolution is denied. The story ends where it should begin. A character forgets what they learned. This isn't nihilism, it's semantic apophysis. The story that defines its meaning through refusal. The listener is forced to ask what should have happened and why it didn't. Through this, narrative function is restored, not by teaching lessons, but by reawakening movement. When a story stops resolving automatically, the audience is no longer a consumer. They become an interpreter again. This is how meaning is returned to time. When perception is overcoded and narrative loops, the symbolic system can still feel unstable. But when logic itself collapses, when the structure of meaning becomes too coherent to be questioned, distortion becomes invisible. The story doesn't need to be believed. It simply becomes the environment. At this level, the Dreamweaver's task is not to supply better information, nor is it to argue for new conclusions. Instead, he must place the audience into a new structure of recognition, one that enacts the collapse of false coherence and makes space for a deeper pattern to emerge. This cannot be taught in principle. It must be felt. That's why we turn here to the story of Percival and the Fisher King, not just because it is an ancient tale, but because it is a myth about what happens when the pattern of understanding itself fails. It is not a story of sin or error. It is a story of misreading, a symbolic system that breaks down because a question is not asked. And through it, we see how the Dreamweaver restores the logic of recognition, not by correcting content, but by restructuring the frame of sense. There is a story. It begins with a young knight, Percival, earnest and naive, entering the world in search of greatness, believing that honor lies in silence, restraint, and the proper performance of his role. He is not arrogant, only innocent. He knows the world has meaning, and he believes it will reveal itself to him if he proves himself worthy. That belief is already the first frame. He travels far and is tested like all knights are. And one day he comes upon a castle that should not be there, hidden, shining, suspended outside the ordinary map of things. He is welcomed, not questioned, not challenged. He is expected. This is already strange. He has entered a symbolic field, and the field is waiting for him to notice. Inside he sees a procession. A grail, radiant, inexplicable, passes before him, carried by a veiled figure. A bleeding king sits in silence. There are wounds that do not close, gestures that repeat. Percival sees all of this. He knows it matters, but he says nothing. He has been told a knight does not speak without cause. He has learned to read scenes as tests of discipline, not as invitations to respond. So he watches and waits and believes he is doing the right thing. This is the moment where the logic breaks. but it does not announce its breaking. The symbolic world continues without him. The ritual plays out. The Grail passes again. The king remains wounded, and still Percival remains silent. He does not ask the question. He does not break the frame. He believes he already understands what story he is in. In the morning, the castle is gone. No explanation, no revelation. The moment has passed. Only later will he learn what was required of him. Not heroism, not purity, just the question. The right one spoken aloud. What is the Grail? Who does it serve? What ails you? He had seen the symbol but failed to engage it. He had entered the structure but refused to disrupt it. He thought that interpretation was beneath him, or worse, unnecessary. And because of that, the entire kingdom remains barren. The king continues to bleed. The symbolic wound is sustained not by evil, but by interpretive failure. This is not a moral tale, it is a structural demonstration. The world was broken not because Percival was weak, but because he assumed the logic of the moment instead of testing it. He believed meaning would unfold without his participation, but meaning required a rupture. The castle, the Grail, the king, they are not just symbols. They are symbolic functions. The Grail is not a thing. It is the vessel that holds what cannot be held. The king is not a man. He is the one who suffers because a question was not asked. The castle is not a place. It is the field where logic waits to collapse. And the collapse is the point. Percival's journey only begins after he fails. He must wander. He must doubt. He must remember what he saw, not as a lesson, but as a structure he misread. The world was not silent. He was. The Grail was not hidden. He looked and did not see. The logic was not broken. It was waiting to be completed by a question that never came. This is the essence of interpretive negation. The Dreamweaver does not offer an answer. He builds a moment like the Grail Castle. He presents a form that the viewer thinks they understand, and then he lets it persist, not to deceive but to wait, to reveal who will speak, who will ask, who will fail. In that failure, recognition begins, not because a truth was revealed, but because the structure broke. The one who thought he knew learns that he does not. And in that break, the logic reconfigures, not into certainty, but into movement. The loop is opened. The wound begins to heal. This is the lesson. The Dreamweaver does not explain. He constructs. And he constructs in such a way that the false interpretation cannot hold. He builds the castle. He puts the Grail in plain sight. He lets the wound bleed, and he waits. Because the only thing that restores structure is not an explanation. It is the question that unmakes the old story. And in that question, the dream begins again.